Hello, everyone. This is Luke Johnson and Dr. Jonathan Cook. Today, we'll be discussing George Orwell's 1984 on noetic.online. Please go and visit the website and join in this discussion and listen to the lesson that we will prepare for you. Dr. Cook, how would you like to begin this session? Maybe I should ask you first, why did you choose this book as the subject of our conversation?
Well, it's partly because of the timeliness of this book, and the fact that it has so many useful lessons to everyone who reads it, and also the fact that I have just taught it this fall to a group of students, which I've done for a few years now. So I always enjoy rereading it, and I'll in the process of trying to delve into a little deeper into the Orwellian canon. I've read some of his other novels. I haven't really read enough of his journalism as I should, because he's considered one of the great 20th century political and literary journalists. I'm trying to fill out my knowledge of some of his other work while I'm deepening my knowledge of this book.
Yeah. It was, I have to say, when you chose this book, I felt like kind of like a sinking feeling in my stomach for a multiplicity of reasons. I traffic in communities where this book is very popular, where a lot of the terminology, newspeak, doublethink, where these ideas are employed quite frequently. I was like, well, how do I talk about this book without interjecting too much of my own personal opinion? But the main thing is that I was worried about it being so dark. It is a dystopic novel.
Yeah.
But the thing that caught me off guard when I was like, okay, we're going to read this book and it's not going to be this psychological downer. It's beautifully written. I forgot, even though I'd read Orwell kind of recently, I forgot how good a writer Orwell is. It's not just like this downer text. It's actually pretty inspired, don't you think?
Yeah, Orwell he's an easy writer to read, but there's nothing simplistic about what he's writing about. He has a gift for clarifying issues, and there's a certain jauntiness to his writing that carries you along, which I think he learned from people like H.G. Wells, and he said he owed a great debt to Somerset Maugham, who is we think of him as a sort of a middle-brow novelist today, but Maugham, he writes very readable fiction, and so that, early 20th century school of writers like Wells and Maugham where Orwell sort of fits in as in terms of his clarity of his style and the sort of brisk feeling for just getting things said and moving on. I think that's a very English quality, but I recognize what you're saying. It's the reading is bracing. Some of it is actually amusing, but then when you get to the end, it's absolutely so dark because of the utter defeat of the main character that everyone who gets to the end of the book just kind of has to sort of cheer themselves up somehow before they jump off a cliff. So.
Well, I think what I do believe that Orwell gave us some secret hope in this text, and we'll see if the listener will be able to pick out what I'm alluding to. It was interesting. I was watching a BBC documentary. I was just at the gym and I had it on my iPhone, so I was mostly listening to it. But I didn't realize there's no footage. There's no sound or there's no visual recordings of George Orwell. So they had in order to do the documentary, they had to hire all these actors to portray him.
Yeah.
And I found that so ironical
Yeah.
that this man who wrote a book whose name is George Orwell, but his real name is Eric Blair.
Yeah.
So we're dealing with a slightly fictitious persona.
Yeah.
We don't really have this great proof of life. I mean, we do, I suppose, for other historical reasons,
Yeah.
but it's interesting that there's no
Yeah.
cinematic documentation of him. It's like it's been memory hold. I thought that
Yeah.
was sort of intriguing in and of itself. Had that occurred to you?
Well, I mean, we know a lot about his life, but yes, it is interesting. You know, he worked for the BBC for 2 years, 1942 and 3, I think, and yet they were not recording those broadcasts. I mean, he was doing the India broadcast pretty much, and creating literary shows and things like that. But I guess the state of recording devices wasn't advanced enough to be able to keep a record of everything. But one thing, let me just mention that.
Oh, sure.
In terms of the identity, the double identity, it's interesting to know that Orwell, you know, he was not creating some kind of persona for himself like Mark Twain, you know, that grew out of his deep sense of sort of being a divided identity, but he actually took the name Orwell because when he published Down and Out in Paris and London in 1932 or 3, had some pretty gross stories about how he was living on the edge of poverty, and he didn't want to embarrass his family because he had, you know, his mother's father was French, so his uncle was his grandfather was French, and he had relatives in Paris, and so he would be embarrassing both relatives in England and France if he published under his own name because of the situations that he describes, you know, scrambling to survive in that book. So he accepted he wanted to have another name on the book, so they came up with like 3 or 4 or 5 names, and they chose George Orwell because Orwell was a river in, I think, Suffolk, where you know, he had some connections where he had lived, or his family had lived, and so they went with that name, George Orwell, just to keep his family from being embarrassed by his first book.
And interestingly enough, I think the name George comes from King George, doesn't it?
Well, I just know that when they suggested names, George Orwell was I guess this was, I guess it was King George. Was it George the Fifth or Anyway, I'm a little vague about when went from George to Edward.
Well, there's a lot of names here. You know, there's some very interesting names in the text. And I don't know how much we want to break down their etymology. There's one name in particular that I'm very intrigued by. I mean, we should get into the discussion of the text. I'll have to say one of the things that got me really excited about this book is that I felt a little bit like a kindred spirit with Orwell because, like you mentioned, he was working in room 101 of the BBC doing reporting, and he realized how easy it was to create propaganda and to manipulate things and create speeches that maybe never even occurred and to falsify events, all in the name of serving the war agenda. And he eventually left that. I had a similar discovery when I first started building Noetic. I was a very trusting person of a lot of the information that I consumed. And I started to understand that by building this platform and having people listen to me, it became very obvious to me how easy it was to manipulate the mind of the masses. And you start thinking about what Hitler could do with the radio. And you live in an era with big tech and social media. And you think if that ever fell into the wrong hands, how would you know? How would you know what you could trust and what you couldn't trust? And how would you know if you yourself were the product of brainwashing where you actually were going around thinking that 2 + 2 was 5. Like, how would you know?
Yeah, well,
And
there's a lot being written on that very topic these days. I just read a book on it called Post-Truth by a guy named Lee McIntyre, who's a philosopher up in New England. So anyway, but I think, though, that you have to realize that Orwell, his sense of the distortion of reality by propaganda was symptomatic of having lived through the rise of Hitler and Stalin in the 1930s, and really knowing what was going on there, because he understands perfectly how these people stay in power, because their whole regime, particularly Hitler, is based on lies, constantly repeated lies. That's what Goebbels said. If you take a lie and you just repeat it enough times, eventually people will accept it, because they just they sort of cave to.
And the bigger the lie, the better.
Yeah.
The bigger the lie, the better.
Yeah, and so as a political observer in the 1930s, I mean, he was writing book reviews and articles as a journalist constantly. From the mid-30s to his death, and so he had his finger on the pulse of the times, like almost no one else.
No.
So
I think a lot of his experiences too were shaped by his own military involvement, even before. Was it with Franco or what? I'm a little sketchy.
Well,
on
he
the
signed up for the
historical
home guards at the beginning of the war. He wanted to join up, but of course his pulmonary issues kept him out of the army. And he got shot. He almost died when he was fighting in Spain when he went down there and wrote Homage to Catalonia after that. I think it was 1937. So he, had, and that was an important experience, because his whole exposure to the politics of the fighting on the side of the Republicans against, Franco, gave him a very brutal education in how all these leftist factions were fighting to gain power within the Republican cause. And the group that he joined, the POOM, which was allied with the Workers' Party that he was part of in England. This POOM group, these Marxist revolutionaries, were suddenly the Trotskyite enemy to the officially endorsed side that Stalin was funding and supplying troops for, the other one of the other factions, and Orwell could have been arrested and killed. Some people were, but he managed to escape out of Spain, and he was later tried in absentia for being a traitor. So he knew the crazy zealotry of the times, where no matter where you were on the ideological spectrum, you could be attacked from all sides.
Totally. Well, maybe we should talk a little bit about the more immediate circumstances that led to the composition of 1984. Do you want to go into those?
Yeah. Well, there's not that much to say. He left London in 1946, and he went up to this remote location in the Inner Hebrides. This is the west side of Scotland, to an island called Jura, because he had someone who was able to loan him a farmhouse up there, and he went up there with his adopted son, Richard. His wife, Eileen, had died about a year earlier during surgery. During to perform, I guess, was a hysterectomy, and so he was on his own. But he he had a nurse for Richard, and he had visitors. He had his sister living there on and off. And he went up for a stint and started writing, but then he went back to London to do some more journalism. Then he went back and finished the book in sort of early 1948. So he was writing, most of it he was writing in a very isolated environment after his wife had died.
Well, he had to be isolated because I think he was very sickly and contagious, wasn't he?
Well, I don't know about the contagion, but yes, his tuberculosis was really becoming more and more aggressive, and he was not. Yeah, I mean, he's fairly young still. Yeah. By today's standards, but his health had been declining, and he kind of ignored it for a while. I mean, he didn't really do everything he could to keep himself from getting well. I mean, it's a question of whether he would have gotten well or not is doubtful.
Yeah, I think he smoked like a chimney. So
and he smoked too. Yeah,
that was not exactly a good recipe for recovery.
Yeah, right.
Well, what about the other book that's really associated with Orwell, and I haven't looked into it in a while, is Animal Farm.
Animal Farm, yeah. Well, that was both of them were kind of conceived. I haven't taught that. You always get that book in high schools, usually in like 8th or 9th grade, which is fine, But interestingly enough, he conceived those books kind of at the same time, and right after the war in 1945, and he published Animal Farm first. He wrote it and published it because it's a shorter book, and because both of them, interestingly enough, both of them would be considered sort of satirical allegories. I mean, Animal Farm much more obviously, but that's what people don't realize is Orwell is really writing as a satirist in 1984. So, and one of his favorite writers is Jonathan Swift. So, there's been a certain amount of commentary on 1984 as a Swiftian text, but I don't think enough has been said about the issue. It's not that we laugh or chuckle at the book, but there's definitely a lot of Swiftian elements in it, especially the depiction of the Ministry of Truth, which recalls a lot of material in Book 3 of Gulliver's Travels. The Academy, the Laputa, the Flying Academy of Laputa, and all these kind of crazy ideas to develop miraculous agriculture and to do all these experiments. Both books emerged out of the post or the end of the war, and both of them are very much focused on the Soviet Union, because I think Orwell realized after the war, during which Russia was aligned with England and America, that things were going to change very quickly, and they did. So I think Orwell, those two books were pretty much focused on with a satirical resonance that applied to the Soviet Union, because he knew that would be that Hitler was defeated by 1945, and this would be this would be the challenge of the future, was dealing with an empowered Soviet Union with Stalin in power.
I tend to agree with that assessment, but one of the things that I think makes 1984 forever timely is not that there could always be some sort of big totalitarian boogeyman over there that we would have to confront in some way, is that it could creep up amongst us so slowly that we may not even know it. And I think that's why I think we need to continue to read this text is, do those people, it's not always, there can be soft totalitarian regimes where like you don't even really it happens in such a fashion that you don't even realize you're a part of it. And I think we need to ask ourselves, as Americans, have we been assimilated into some form of totalitarianism in order to make sure that that never happens? And what's interesting is I was doing some research for this, discussion. I came across an article from the New York Times in around 2000 or whatever. I was interested in the movie adaptations of the, and I didn't realize there was one from like 1956. Have you seen the black and white one? Do you know who produced that movie?
I've seen images of it. The one I know is from John Hurt from the early 80s.
There's an earlier one. And do you know who bought the production rights for both Animal Farm and 1984?
Who?
The CIA.
Ah. Huh.
And they changed the endings.
Ah.
And I just against Orwell's wishes. Against Orwell's wishes. In the I'll find the article.
Yeah. Well, he wasn't around, after 1950, so it was Sonia, the woman he married when he was dying, in 1949, who controlled his estate. He formed a little company to protect his royalties, and she had a lot to do with approving projects related to his work. I'm not sure about how much that applied to film adaptations.
The article was written by Lawrence Zuckerman in the New York Times, March 18th, 2000. It's entitled "How the CIA Played Dirty Tricks with Culture." So if anybody wants to go check it out, it's
I don't know the article. So there's an Orwell industry of books and articles about 1984 and about his impact, and his biography too has been written by many people, because originally he did not want a biography, and then his wife was sort of limiting access to information, and so there's been a steady stream of biographies which claim to have more information than the previous ones.
Well, so I think obviously we've talked about how he definitely had he thought the Russian Revolution was misguided, and he thought that it would inevitably sort of feast on itself, right? That's sort of the moral. Yeah.
But the thing about the book is he, 1984, it really pays to know a little bit about Soviet history in the 1930s, because there's lots of specific parodic references to events from that time, such as the picture of Rutherford, Jones, and Aronson that he finds, and that gives him a sense that the party's been lying to everyone for years. It's pretty much based on the show trials and terror of the 1937, 1938, particularly three famous Soviet, communist Marxist heroes, Bukharin, Zinoviev, and Kamenev. These were three of the giants of the revolution, who were all, accused of, betraying the party by Stalin, and they were executed. This was like shocking that these heroes of the revolution, but that was typical of the insanity of that era, because Stalin was just killing people left and right, and it was just horrific.
Have you seen this movie that came out recently called Death of Stalin?
No, I want to though.
It's good.
I've heard about it. Yes,
it's worth your time. But it's a comedy, but people are getting murdered all over the place.
Yeah. And when the speaker during Hate Week, is there shouting, denouncing, Eurasia as the enemy, and suddenly he gets a piece of paper and he changes his speech in mid-sentence, going, from Eurasia to East Asia as the enemy,
Right.
based on, the Hitler-Stalin Pact of August 1939. I mean, that change on a dime of two countries that were, telling each other they were, horrific enemies, and then suddenly they were allies. So that's when everyone realized just how dangerous the world had suddenly become with the Soviet Union not putting up a front to Hitler's aggression, and then of course they divided up Poland, and the World War began in September 1939 as Hitler drove into Poland, and Stalin claimed the other eastern half of the country. So anyway, you get a lot of satirical resonance or historical resonance if you prep yourself with a little bit of historical knowledge of Russia, Soviet Union in the second half of the 30s, pretty much the whole decade of the 30s, and as well as the war experience, which is obviously kind of what is important for the setting of the book in Winston Smith's London.
Yeah, and I mean, I wouldn't limit it to knowledge of what was going on in the 30s and in Russia. I mean, I'd push it back even further to how the First World War set up the preconditions for the second, and I mean, really, it's never ending how far back you can push it to better understand how the totalitarian grip and these world wars came to be.
Yeah,
and the power behind the powers. So what do you think gave? I mean, you've sort of mentioned it already, but well, actually, before I ask that question, how I mean, you've sort of said that this is a satire.
Yeah.
Do you want to elaborate on that? I mean, a lot of people call it a dystopian fantasy. Yeah. Do you have any other descriptions that you would use for it, or comparisons? What do you?
Well, the thing about satire, satire is not really a form; it's a medium. So you can have dramatic satire, narrative satire, and so it's a dystopian satire, which is a tradition in England. I mean, Samuel Butler's Erewhon is a famous example, and H.G. Wells wrote sort of negative utopias as well. So, so he's mixing this genre of dystopian fantasy with obvious exaggeration and irony, which are typical traits of satire. You take something and you're indignant, you're angry about it, you're morally offended by it, and then so you kind of amplify it and simplify it to show what's wrong with it, but still making it recognizable as a potential reality. So he was taking facts and distorting them to create a narrative that, it's not really traditional fiction. The characters are sort of two-dimensional, but on the other hand, he's not writing a novel like Henry James or Marcel Proust. He's writing sort of political fiction like Swift.
Right. Well, and it sort of depends on one's perspective too. I mean, a lot of the things that he's writing about may have seemed like exaggerations.
Yeah.
But then they start to come true.
Yeah, right. Well, the idea of the telescreen.
Yeah.
Constant surveillance. Little did he know that that would be a reality today of two-way communication, visual communication, and monitoring.
Right. Well, everything's right as a result of diminished civil liberties. Everything. I mean, pretty much everything we say and do is tracked.
Yeah.
We can get into a conversation about why that happened, but I mean, I think that's a scenario that you know, that no one could have imagined, uh, back in
Yeah.
1948,
Well, he's just, he's taking what was true in his world and just extrapolating into the future.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, what do you make of the idea? That was the interesting thing, is about how much of the reality that people experienced in Oceania, you never knew if it was real or not. There were so many events that, or even wasn't it Julia that was saying to Winston all the time that she didn't even believe that the war existed?
yeah.
It, so, that
Well,
they were constantly kind of kept in a state of hate and fear and sexual debasement as a result of events that weren't even true. And
yeah.
I think that's interesting to think about, is could that ever happen to us?
Well, that's interesting because I've read an article or a chapter of a book that came down on Orwell for claiming that 85% of the population could be proles, that they would be so depoliticized that you get to have such a huge portion of the populace who were so unplugged from any kind of um, concern with reality and the truth and things like that. But I think that you're dealing with what you found in the Soviet Union, where you had the people and the party. There were two divisions. You had the party who had all the power, and then you had the people who were just struggling to survive, and just so obsessed with keeping themselves fed and housed that they just didn't have time to engage in any kind of social protest, and they were kept ignorant through limits of education and stream of lies and popular culture. If you feed them with music and books and pornography, they won't turn their attention to politics so much. But one of the things in some of my recent research, I'm into the sources of this book. There's a guy named James Burnham who wrote a book called The Managerial State in about 1940, and then he was a Marxist. He actually was friends with Trotsky in Chicago in the later 30s, and this book, The Managerial Revolution, it's called, he projected these superstates of the future based on the new kind of totalitarianism that was coming out of, first of all, Germany and then Russia. And a lot of the things you find in Orwell, you find in this guy's book. And Orwell actually reviewed the Managerial Revolution in a long review and sort of took issue with a lot of things he said. But it's clear that he was very much influenced by him when he put together the sort of future historical conditions in 1984. And this guy Burnham, actually, he ended up making a complete change and becoming a friend of William Buckley and writing for
What?
his he was like Whittaker Chambers. Some of these diehard communists who at the some during World War II saw the light and became these rabid right-wingers. So this guy, James Burnham, he actually contributed to the National Review. He was a big figure in the early 60s in conservative circles as a, keeping up everyone's guard about the Soviet Union. But he's quite an interesting figure. He was a philosophy professor, actually, and in Chicago.
No.
And
Doesn't surprise me.
Quite influential in the 40s and 50s.
Yeah, you get a lot of the neoconservative movement coming out of Chicago.
Coming out of the
It doesn't surprise me at all. And
So and there's another interesting book that influenced him was a novel called We by Evgeny Zemyatin, which came out in 1924, 1925, which is a dystopian fantasy that has some very interesting similarities to 1984, but doesn't have quite as bleak an ending. And it's a very entertaining book, actually. I read it a while ago, but
well, that's
Orwell read it and reviewed it, actually.
That's something you keep mentioning, that the book is bleak, and something that I would push back on that is, yeah, it's bleak, but like, the numbers far outweigh the people being, the oppressors are so few compared to the oppressed. We can stop it from happening, right? If we only understood our strength. So it's not inevitable, right?
Well, I'm sorry. What are you saying? The development of the
Well, the book isn't as bleak as you keep mentioning that the book is bleak, and I said, yeah, it's definitely bleak, but at the same time, there isn't a sense of inevitability to the book
that this has to happen to us. Yeah,
that we can fight it, that we can push back against it, that we can halt it.
That was his whole point. He wanted to make it shocking so it would wake people up.
Sure.
And so everyone would recognize any kind of creeping symptoms of what his vision was depicting, he had a definite purpose in writing this book.
Well, we've talked a little bit about how. Do you want to say anything more about how his life impacted the development of the text, or have we covered that a good bit?
Let me just think. He definitely, his wife Eileen worked in the Ministry of Information,
right.
Which is kind of like reminds you of the Ministry of Truth in the book, and he used some of his work at the BBC for caricaturing that at the Ministry of Information, and he gives a sense of the deprivations of wartime Britain in Winston Smith's life, with going to the cafeteria at the Ministry of Truth and having all this terrible food presented, this soupy mix with little pieces of, meat floating around in it, and the saccharin substitutes, and all of that gives a sense of wartime Britain, which he definitely knew.
Victory pies, right?
Yeah. So he was sort of caricaturing that experience.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because one of the things that we know about him is he actually had some affairs during his marriage. So, meeting Julia over the Mr. Charrington's shop, having these little trysts, was something he actually had done himself, to a certain extent during his marriage, and but I don't think there's any one model of Julia amongst the people that he knew.
I think he got married at the end of his life. Like he had like a bedside marriage.
Yeah, but he married Eileen O'Shaughnessy in 1936.
Yeah.
And he was definitely a lonely man after his wife died, because he actually proposed to 2 or 3 women.
They shot him down.
And they shot him down. Yeah, and then he was able to convince this woman to marry him. I think mainly because he wanted to secure his estate and make sure his his adopted son would be taken care of. So it was kind of a cautionary gesture because he was already bedridden by the time he married Sonia.
Yeah.
So.
Well, so you have a better understanding of the entirety of his writings. I mean, how would you say that 1984 fits into them?
Yeah, so his previous novel to the 1984 was Coming Up for Air, 1939, which it's kind of a Wellesian novel about a middle-aged man revisiting some place where he grew up before World War I and being nostalgic about all the things that have been lost from the Britain that he treasured. So it kind of reminds you of Winston Smith trying to find out about the past and these mundane things about England before 1930 that Winston is trying to get from the guy in the pub, when all he wants to talk about is, the top hats and all these ridiculously irrelevant things. So the nostalgia for an older Britain, you find in Coming Up for Air. And of course, two of his books were documentary studies about poverty, Down and Out in Paris and London and The Road to Wigan Pier. So, he his big hero when he wrote those books was Jack London, who wrote about living with the poor in England and also about being a tramp. So Winston, in his misery and poverty, he's not really poor, but he's physically deprived. The sense of social justice and economic fairness was something that Orwell really was concerned with throughout his life, and that's why he called himself a socialist, even though he wrote books that criticized, extreme forms of socialism or communism. So
Yeah, I wonder how you could properly characterize his political views, because I think he knew the danger. Obviously, if he's writing about so much totalitarian government, he understands how big government could possibly take on this very pernicious form. Like, how do you square that circle as someone who knows how it's possible for corruption to occur, but is also sympathetic to a socialist cause? Like, it seems like that might be an insuperable paradox in some ways. I haven't read much of his directly political writings or his diaries or anything like that to know, but it would seem like a hard
He was a
position.
democratic socialist, so he was absolutely devoted to democracy. So, but he also advocated economic equality, which meant, in a very class-ridden Britain, where you have these huge disparities in income and class, he really hated the class system. I mean, he wanted a much more equal England, and he thought that, after the war would be the great class equalizer because everyone had to pull their own weight and fight together, So after the war, you couldn't afford to have a class system anymore because everyone had sacrificed so much. So he was a man of the left, but he was also a fanatical Democrat as well.
Yeah, I just wonder if he came to realize that a classless society was an illusion because of the sort of universal misery that we see in 1984. I mean, obviously there are tiers above, the what everyone is subjected to. What are the different classes in 1984? There's the.
I'm sorry. Say that again.
What are the
different classes?
Yeah, the different classes in 1984. I mean, the vast majority.
Well, you get the inner party. Inner party is 2%.
Right.
The outer party is 13%, and then the proles are 85%. So
right.
It sort of corresponds to the intellectual leaders like the Communist Party, and then the bureaucrats who enforce the laws, and then you have everyone else who's living
And then you
outside of
have
the government.
and then you have this um, amorphous secret organization, right? The was it the Great Brotherhood, the great something to this effect?
Well,
That
the Brotherhood, which is, which is an organization that O'Brien is leading, but you don't really. I mean, it seems as though it's all a fabrication to keep people loyal, because it seems like the government is just creating this false image of a brother, and that's how they entrap Winston.
right.
Um,
Well, what do you, I mean,
it's just
yeah.
like Trotskyism in the Soviet Union. Trotsky was used as a scapegoat for any kind of counter-revolutionary activity or thinking. So it's something that is pretty much a fabrication of the state to keep everyone, loyal, because there's the external and the internal enemy, right? So you need them both to keep people constantly loyal to your regime.
So the lesson to be learned there is that there is no great resistance to the party, that it's sort of a
No, that
psychological operation to entrap.
it's a careful fabrication to entrap people who are deviants from the party line. I mean, we want to
Yeah.
believe in it, but I
Yeah,
think the
that's it.
message, just like the end of the book, is that Big Brother will get you in the end because there's no one else to stop them. There's no brotherhood. There's only Big Brother.
These things can be co-opted as well. They can be infiltrated.
Yeah.
But so you know, I think, right, that this 1984 was not sort of universally received with tons of encomium. Some people have characterized the characters as being shallow. I think you
Yeah.
mentioned Harold Bloom, but there's also been a feminist critique of the novel. What say you on these
Yeah. I
matters?
mean, these days, of course, I think people recognize that it's a political classic, but of course, there's people today who are willing to critique it pretty ruthlessly. I mean, there's a woman named Daphne Patai who has come down on Orwell for the depiction of Julia and her sort of sexual promiscuity, and the depiction of women in that book. I mean, there's only one woman really. And the fact that the characters too are very simplistic. Well, I mean, if he's writing satire, you're not going to get three-dimensional characters. I mean, I think we can all, recognize Winston Smith as a fully developed human being, but I mean, he's not a Jamesian character. He's not. He exists to point out a political lesson. So you have to sort of approach the book from the proper, intellectual's perspective to realize its merits. You can't just take the, your own sort of category of criticism and think that, it's going to fit. So, I don't know.
What about
the book is built up a sort of aura about it, so people like to sort of attack that because you don't want to be too reverent about things, because you might not think that that you can say anything more about them if they've attained some kind of protected status as a classic.
What do you think? I mean, what's your assessment of the text? I mean, do you think it's? Where do you think it ranks, or? What do you
Well,
think its utility is?
I
Do you think it's just to
mean,
get the conversation going, or I mean, stylistic assessment? I mean, I'd love to know what you think.
I think that everyone should read the book because of its powerful synthesis of literary and political wisdom, and it's a unique book for our times, and because it is accessible, but it's also very profoundly framed as a statement about the threats to the human future in the way we live, with technology and the era of the current phase of human civilization. So this is something we have to be very on guard about.
I think it's interesting that it's taught in this country. I don't know how it's taught throughout the country, but I think I read it in ninth or 10th grade. I don't think I had the brain to get my mind around it at that age. I
Well, wait, did you
wonder,
read it in high school?
I did, but I feel like I was too young for it. But it was a different time too. I don't know. I I feel like it should be more promoted at the college level.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
it's
I think he's probably making a big comeback today. He's certainly getting he's getting a lot of sales in the last couple of years in the U.S.
well,
and every week there's some new article about
well. Why don't you talk about that
the
for a
the,
second?
the, the
About
attack on truth.
why don't you speculate on? I haven't looked at the statistics, but I'll trust you on it about why this book is selling so well.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, booksellers are saying there's been a huge surge.
Why do you
So,
think that is? Feel free to state your opinion. I mean, I won't.
well, because we have a president who is whose every pronouncement is likely to be false, and who creates all kinds of vicious attacks on the news and talks about fake news and it's just things that he doesn't like. So he's creating an aura of unreality to create doubt in our minds about what is real and what is not real, which is a way that tyrannies attain and maintain power. But fortunately, we have a media that is calling him out, and we have government agencies that are investigating a lot of his criminal activities. So, we could very well see his ouster from our government within the next year or two. So,
So
I think, now we really know what it's like to be constantly fed misleading information by the government, mainly the executive, and this is pretty much a new phenomenon for most Americans having to deal with this, and a third of the population thinks what he says is great because they have drunk the Kool-Aid, and they are so uninformed about the reality that they accept his version of it, which is frankly terrifying for a lot of people.
So I think that's part of the equation. I think that is definitely a reason why this book is selling amongst our group. But I also think that there are other groups that this book is appealing to that could give us a fuller picture about why this book is selling. Um, and if I can just sort of look, I don't want anyone listening to this thinking that I've got some sort of political agenda here, because I don't. I mean, I don't identify with any political party. I can truly say that. Um, but I want to go back to a question I asked earlier. I don't know, I'm no Trump fan, but I don't know if it's necessarily wrong to question the nature of the information that we consume and to search out the facts for ourselves and try to exercise and sharpen our discernment. I don't know if there's necessarily anything wrong with questioning established narratives. And I guess the other thing I would ask, is it possible that the things that we have trusted could have been infiltrated, could have been compromised at some point, and we have been taking in Kool-Aid unknowingly? So it really comes back to a question of could we have become collectively brainwashed? And if we could have become collectively brainwashed, how could we free ourselves from that? I hope that's not too disturbing a question to ask, but I think it's one we need to. I think it's healthy.
Right.
What do you think?
In a well-functioning democracy with certain, especially the right of freedom of speech, the protection of the idea of truth is like the principal concern of every person who wants to have a functioning government. So, as long as we protect our constitutional rights, and have enough people discussing their political viewpoints, whatever they are, and looking for the truth. I mean, the problem is when you undermine the idea of truth, which is sort of a postmodern idea, there are no facts, there's only interpretations. I mean, that is catastrophic if you undermine things like, the idea of climate change or, medicine and all the things that, represent the advances of civilization and protecting our future. So I think devotion to truth has to be very carefully guarded against erosions from the right and the left, because, postmodernism has created a whole, sheaf of writers who were, a lot of coming from France, like Derrida and Lyotard, and, people who are sort of attacking the idea of objectivity and scientific truth. So this, I think, is a threat from the left, but I don't think it's as serious as the threats from the right, which is, the authoritarianism we see in our current government, and it's the political party that has dominated the government, for the last 2 years.
Do you think there are do you think there are questions or ideas that are dangerous?
Questions or ideas? Well, dangerous in what way?
Well, see, it's like, what if someone was just merely questioning progress? I mean, is that a problem? Or what we conceive progress to be? Or what if someone was questioning the foundational facts of what we understand reality to be? I mean, is that a problem?
Well, I think science, all kinds of inquiry thrives on questions, but then you have to examine them and sift them through and follow them to their logical conclusions. So,
but like if someone, just for instance, I don't particularly have a strong opinion on this, but let's say someone was questioning climate change. Is that dangerous? Is it dangerous to question climate change?
Well, it's dangerous if you're trying to deny it exists, and in 20 years the coastlines of the world are gone, because we know that sea levels are rising, and we can pretty much predict how quickly it's happening. so that if you don't make changes and try to stop it or make allowances for what science is, the overwhelming majority of science is telling us, then you're really, being very stupid and I would say criminal.
So just so I understand, if the consensus of a scientific community says something and someone questions that, that's a dangerous question.
Well, if they can question all they want, but if they have influence and question it to convince people that it's not true, that if you convince a lot of the electorate that something is not true that is true, then you are doing a real disservice to the public. And I would say, if those people are going to suffer and die as a result of your actions, then you are a moral criminal. So,
and truth is defined as scientific consensus.
Yeah, because we know a lot. We've come a long way since cavemen.
Yeah.
But anyway,
I just want to know what truth was and what are dangerous questions and what we can and cannot. And I think that's a big part of the conversation about this era, is about what we can and cannot question, what is truth, and what things are what, as a society, what are our sacred cows? What things will we not slaughter? So I actually, I don't have a particular axe to grind with climate change or anything like that, but I'm just kind of trying to feel out what the boundaries are here.
Yeah.
So I'll put it in a book one day.
Okay. All right. But, do we have anything more to say about George Orwell?
Oh man, we could talk about it forever, man. What do you think? Well, I had one question.
Yeah.
This, who do you think Emmanuel Goldstein is?
Well,
name is that's a very significant name that Orwell chose.
Well, to me, it's obvious it's Trotsky, right? Jewish revolutionary leader who wrote the book, the Revolution Betrayed, which was the basis of the book that Winston gets, the theory and practice of oligarchical collectivism. I think that's pretty much transparently based on Trotsky's personality in his book, and the fact that he looks like a sheep, in the video, in the Hate, 2 Minutes of Hate, the caricature of him as a Jewish intellectual, pretty much that to me is satirical reconfiguration of a historical scapegoat. But it's typical that he has a Jewish name because, Jews have always been, historical figures of scapegoating.
Sure. The name Emmanuel is interesting too, right? It was one of the names that was given to Jesus.
Yeah, right.
All right. It doesn't mean God is with us or something like that, or?
Yeah.
I think that's what that means.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's some interesting religious aspects to the novel that we could. I don't think we have time to get into, but because Orwell himself was pretty much an agnostic, even though he had an Anglican funeral, and he sort of embraced the Anglican Church, even though he didn't believe.
I do think that Orwell did give us a little bit of hope, a little bit of a gift here. One of my favorite passages from the text is when, I guess it's right before or during when Winston's being tortured.
Yeah.
I believe O'Brien says to him, "Do you suppose it's beyond us to produce a dual system of astronomy? The stars can be near or distant according as we need them. Do you suppose our mathematicians are unequal to that? Have you forgotten doublethink?"
Yeah.
I think Orwell is trying to tell us something.
Well,
but
to me, it's the insanity of O'Brien, which is is kind of like, we're going to recreate the reality which is what happens when you have absolute power and you sort of believe your own, it's sort of magical thinking that children have, like I can do anything.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So I love it when he says we're going to abolish the orgasm.
Yeah. There's so many great.
Yeah.
There's so many great lines here. Yeah. What do you have any other favorite parts of the text?
Well, that whole speech of O'Brien when he's been tortured, it is something that, everyone should read at some point in their life, and maybe repeatedly, right? About how torture works and how the government enforce its party line with this ultimate resort to force and pain, human pain is how they keep in power. And the idea of, especially the idea of being power for its own sake, which is something that is profoundly disturbing, right? If governments are only there to enjoy the exercise of power, the fact that they can hurt people and tell people what to do, the kind of exhilaration you get from being in charge of something, that's the only reason, you have no other purpose as a government. That is a profoundly upsetting idea. And tyrannies are based on that very idea. Totalitarian governments. So,
have you ever read Hannah Arendt?
What's the Hannah Arendt?
Have you ever read Hannah Arendt?
Oh yeah.
I feel like she would pair well with this.
Yeah. Origins of Totalitarianism. She's pretty much focused on Nazi Germany, right?
Yeah,
and Eichmann and Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Yeah, she's I like her work. I don't know her that well.
She's incredible. That was one of the best discoveries that I made in graduate school. I had never heard of Hannah Arendt before my PhD, and then I got introduced to those two books and The Life of the Mind, and she's a mind-blowing thinker.
Yeah.
I love her. So.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Dr. Cook. It was an invigorating conversation. I hope it wasn't too controversial. And thank you, everyone, for listening with us. And hopefully our conversation has been a provocative one and has got you questioning and got you interested in reading this text and sort of looking at the news headlines and applying it to your reality and seeing just how relevant the text still is. Because I think that's something Dr. Cook and I are in very much agreement about, is that this book is essential.
Yeah. And Orwell's journalism is brilliant as well. He was just a wonderful reviewer and essayist, so there's a whole cornucopia of work from him that you can enjoy. It's pretty good for someone who died at the age of 46.
I'm always astounded how these people are able to churn out so much work and have their lives cut short, whether it's George Orwell or Kierkegaard or
Plus he's writing on a typewriter too. Yeah.
Well, maybe there's something to that, The limitations might be good for productivity. And hey, you're no slouch. You're quite productive. I was saying before
I'd be nowhere without my computer though.
Well, I haven't churned out a lot, but I have a feeling when I turn on the spigot, a lot's going to come out. I think someone described Orwell as that there was a smoldering fire within him the entire time, and then it just took over. In a very short period of time, he was very productive. I think I feel like that works with a lot of people. I think that happened with Hegel. Hegel was kind of drifting along, and then just bam, it all came out. And I think Kant produced a lot of stuff late in life. It seems like there are periods of inspiration that people go through. So.
Yeah, I can't imagine writing with your quill pen, writing masterpieces of philosophy, with a quill. Amazing.
Yeah, well, it really goes to say, it really makes you think about how much the human mind has changed as a result of modernity.
Yeah.
And I put and this is relevant to 1984, right? Like how much of our modern comforts are slowing our minds down so that we can't even fathom how quickly our intellectual ancestors were able to think and how productive they could be, right? Like I don't watch any television. I doubt you watch very much television. You don't seem like someone who watches a lot of television, but I get really worried about just how stupefying and hypnotizing TV is. I see people get in front of the TV and they're just gone. And I wonder how much that's.
I'd be more worried about social media and
well, that too,
iPhones.
that too,
So
that too, both of them, and how much that really degrades the human IQ. And if we're actually going through a period of de-evolution as the result of our technology.
Yeah, well, the majority of people get their news through social media, not through traditional news outlets. So that's a profoundly disturbing idea. But there's a lot of writing on this subject today, so there's no lack of people to turn to.
No, maybe we should check it out sometime. It'll be interesting. There are a lot of provocative stuff being written right now. All right, Dr. Cook. Well, thank you so much. I gotta go.
Okay.
Gotta go do other teacher things.
Okay.
All
right.
chapter 12 of Genesis, I believe, is tonight. All right. Have a good night, everyone.
Okay.
Take care.